Coming up on This Week in Radio Tech, you heard about the CrowdStrike problem that affected millions of computers around the world and some broadcasters as well, although many broadcasters were spared. We'll find out why. We'll find out a little bit about CrowdStrike and how to avoid such problems in the future and some good best practices for your IT security. We've got a couple of great guests coming up next on TWiRT.
This Week in Radio Tech is brought to you by Broadcasters General Store with outstanding service, savings, and support. Online at bgs.cc. By Broadcast Bionics with the Bionics Studio, including talk show control, social media, and visual radio. Broadcast Bionics brings exceptional audience engagement to radio and TV. By Angry Audio. Audio problems disappear when you get angry at angryaudio.com. By Nautel, worry-free transmission you can count on with outstanding control, reliability, efficiencies, and Nautel's unmatched 24/7 customer support. Online at nautel.com. And by Max Connect Wireless, prioritized high-speed internet service designed for transmitter sites and remote broadcasts.
Hey, welcome into This Week in Radio Tech, the show where we talk about everything from the microphone to that light bulb at the top of the tower. And today we're going to talk about CrowdStrike, because that was in the news, and the show is called This Week in Radio Tech. So we're talking about the CrowdStrike problem that did affect some radio broadcasters, apparently a fair number of TV broadcasters, and we all know lots of airlines and banks and lots of other institutional computer users around the world. We'll get to that in a couple of minutes. And we're also going to take toward the end of the show, talk about best IT practices, because so many of you engineers in radio, your organizations you work with do not use CrowdStrike. You may use Windows, but you don't use CrowdStrike. And so we'll talk about what you should know anyway about some best IT practices. So that's what's coming up. I'm Kirk Harnack. I'm here in the Telos Alliance studio in Nashville, Tennessee. So glad to have you along. And hey, if you like the show, please, do the usual like and subscribe. We appreciate your participation and support of the show. And we have some sponsors. So please be sure you check out the sponsors' messages. And if you need what they offer, and even if you don't, check him out anyway. All right. Chris Tarr is under the weather, so he's not going to be with us today. Say a prayer for Chris. Send good thoughts his way. His voice is still not doing well. Let's hope Chris gets better. But we have not one, but two guests today. And let's bring in the old familiar guest with whom you all already know. And that's Shaun Dolan from Chicago. Shaun, welcome in. Good to see you, man.
Hey, good to see you too. Yeah, there are maybe a few folks that have had the unfortunate or the misfortune of meeting me, but yeah, no, doing well. Thanks for having me.
Shaun, you're with a company called InRush. You're a partner at InRush. Real quick, what does InRush do?
Yeah, InRush is a broadcast integration firm dealing mostly with radio stations, doing everything from building studios to implementing the same in the cloud.
Cool. All righty. And you have plenty of IT experience and the integration of IT and radio broadcasting usually. And you've done some amazing things there. So I'm going to want to hear some amazing things from you as the show goes on. We also have as our guest someone that Shaun recommended. And I just met him 10 minutes ago. And so far, it's been a fascinating conversation. And that is Kyle Walker. Kyle, also from the Chicago area. Kyle, welcome in. Glad to have you along.
Thanks, Kirk. Pleasure to be here.
You are with a group of broadcasters called Weigel, and that's TV stations and TV networking, right?
That's right. Yeah, we have local stations throughout the U.S. as well as some national platforms that we distribute on Weigel stations as well as other broadcast group stations.
Cool. And of course, you are highly involved with a lot of IT in operating those stations and also these national networks that you originate and distribute, right?
That's right.
Good. All right. Well, tell you what, we're going to take our first real quick commercial announcement. When we come back from this announcement from Nautel, we're going to jump right into our topic of CrowdStrike. Now, so many of you engineers already have heard of that. It happened almost a week ago. And a lot of you have already, followed up to see what it was, who it affected, maybe why it affected you or why it didn't affect you. It certainly was probably the largest mishap in computing, in IT operations, maybe ever, with the number of disruptions that it caused. And so we're not going to delve deeply into the mechanics of what happened. We'll talk about that just briefly, but we also want to talk about in the first part of our show what who was affected and what the implications were and what they had to do about it. And then during the middle of the show, we've got a terrific interview with a guy named David Smedley. Dave's a British fellow. He is the senior support guy for AIR. That's AIIR. You may have heard of them. They merged about a year ago with Playout One, which is a popular playout automation system. And David has some good information about the CrowdStrike problem, and then some best practices for IT for the rest of us who are broadcast engineers. So that's coming up, and then we'll finish the show with a discussion of best practices for IT security from both Shaun and from Kyle Walker. So that's coming up. Hey, our show is brought to you in part by Nautel, friendly to the broadcast industry. Oh my goodness, I love these guys at Nautel. I've got a number of their transmitters at my own radio stations, and they're doing this thing called the HD Digital Radio Test Drive. And what's a test drive? Well, you've taken car test drives before. This is a test drive that you've got to have a little skin in the game. You still have to have a Nautel transmitter, but there are benefits here that you can put off some expense while you take this test drive. It's intended to break down some barriers that are keeping many broadcasters from trying HD radio. HD radio transmission has the potential to create presence on the car dashboard, which, AM and FM stations have kind of been losing out on, and help stations stay competitive in a field of alternative media choices. So it's based on Nautel's software-based air chain technology. And this is so cool because they can offer this to you in this test drive mode. HD Digital Radio Test Drive allows you, the broadcaster, to try HD radio transmission in your market for up to 6 months to try to unlock more listeners, more content, and new revenue potential without needing to install and purchase upwards of $40,000 or $50,000 of HD gear. So there's an easy, minimal cost option to turn on HD radio so you can try these things and counter competing alternate media, get real-world market data based on 6 months of trial time. And to get started, you need to lease or purchase a Nautel GV2 transmitter. That's an FM transmitter. Or if you have a Nautel GV transmitter already, you upgrade it to a GV2. You also need an Xperi main station or equivalent license, and you need a signed trial agreement with Nautel. Plus, give it some content, okay? At least one channel. You're doing that anyway, but you can supply up to 4 channels of audio programming delivered via Livewire or AES-67. And of course, my employer can help you with that. And so can others. AES-67 feeds in there as well. So check this thing out. Contact your Nautel representative and get the details on how this works for you. We went ahead and jumped in my first station to do HD about a year ago. We put it on the air in Oxford, Mississippi, and just loving how this thing works. Needed a little help from Nautel to get the software just right, and they were right there to hold our hand and carry us along, and it's working just great. Thanks, Nautel. Nautel.com for sponsoring This Week in Radio Tech. All right, guys, sorry I started the show a couple minutes late, and so let's get right into it. CrowdStrike. This affected a lot of people starting, I think, far to our east, maybe in Australia, were the first broadcasters to wake up noticing that they had a problem. Which of you just want to set the stage as to, give us a couple of paragraphs on how CrowdStrike, or what it is and why it affected some broadcasters? Who wants that question? Don't anybody raise your hand.
I could jump in on that.
All right. Go ahead, Kyle.
So CrowdStrike is a platform that is a malware protection system, and I'll just give kind of a high-level generic version of it, not really jumping deep into the technical weeds. But its principle of how it works is it monitors behavior of your PC. So unlike some other traditional antivirus systems that have a list of rules that say, hey, if you see this, take this action, scan all these files and see if they're clean. It takes a completely different approach because CrowdStrike's mindset in this modern day world is there's so many zero-day viruses, you can't possibly track everything. Even if you can and you find something, it could take days before it's resolved. So they do a behavioral snapshot of that machine, your network environment, and when they see that shows the signature of what could be malicious behavior, it stops that behavior immediately. And depending on what type of service you have with CrowdStrike, they have their own engineers that can dial into that machine, doing an investigation, or you could set up your agreement with CrowdStrike to say, hey, we will take like a tier 1, and we'll have you guys take a tier 2. But at the end of the day, it is more of a premium malware protection endpoint solution.
And either of you maybe correct me or add to what I'm saying here. CrowdStrike certainly seems not to be in heavy use among mom and pop operators. It seems to be much more in use with large corporations, especially publicly traded corporations, because they have rules that they have to adhere to. Maybe I'm speaking old information here that's changed, but there was Sarbanes-Oxley that publicly traded companies had to work with. I remember 15 years ago, I would talk to broadcasters about using IP radios to deliver their STL, their audio, to a transmitter site or maybe even public internet. And they would come back and tell me, nope, our lawyers won't let us do that. We have to use licensed spectrum only. We can't use unlicensed spectrum. And even some of them even said, we just can't use IP radios. Our lawyers won't let us do that. And that was in adherence with some governance practices. So large corporations, some of them take the road of, hey, instead of hiring 300 IT people, let's hire 30 IT people and outsource some of our protection so that we can say, with great legitimacy, we can say, yes, we're protected. Our shareholders are protected financially because we're using this wonderful outsourced malware and intrusion protection system, in this case from CrowdStrike. Am I too off base with that, or does that describe a lot of the reason to use CrowdStrike?
Yeah, I think, Kirk, that's accurate. And one of the things, sound like a salesman here, that really is a benefit to CrowdStrike, and I've seen a scenario where this situation has happened. Let's say you have an environment where there's been a major breakthrough of an IT system, and you've got machines that are down. CrowdStrike claims, and generally multiple stories I've heard here, even in the city, you'll put CrowdStrike on that computer, and suddenly you have IT people going from a complete panic of, we thought we fixed it, the problem's back. We thought we fixed it again a day later, the problem's back. You throw CrowdStrike on there, and it just immediately stops. It's almost tempting for smaller organizations to say, let's just put CrowdStrike on as a Hail Mary on every single machine, and we'll be covered. Chances are you probably will be. That's not the best practice to say, invest in CrowdStrike and you're done. But it is that type of system to where it is very intelligent. And generally speaking, it works very well. We've caught, even in our own situation, we've seen some systems that we've had with CrowdStrike where a vendor partner has software that actually had some very minor malicious code in it, but the vendor had no idea. CrowdStrike caught it. But hey, somewhere in your packaging, you've got this hash. They didn't think so. Then they went and did some investigation and said, wow, you guys are actually right. They issued out a notice to all their customers and, eventually fixed that problem. But it's platforms like CrowdStrike that are able to catch those things, where traditional antivirus applications that just say scan all the files would never catch those kind of hash incidents.
Yeah. So because of my own curiosity, I have been doing some research in the last couple of days. And as a radio engineer myself, I'd like to share a couple things that I thought were interesting about what I found out about how CrowdStrike works and how it's different from ordinary off-the-shelf antiviruses. CrowdStrike is a kernel driver. And in fact, it's a must-load kernel driver, must boot. Windows will not boot without this driver, without the CrowdStrike driver, kernel driver also booting. And that's why a lot of people got the blue screen of death, or part of the reason. And that driver has to be signed, and it's highly, highly vetted by Microsoft. So there's a very close partnership between CrowdStrike and Microsoft on the validity and the authenticity and the robustness of this driver. So you got to say, well, okay, well, what went wrong then? What went wrong? Well, the driver also depends on configuration or system update files that are not necessarily signed. They're not, the individual update files are not individually vetted by Microsoft. They trust the driver, and the driver reaches out and says, okay, let me see the latest file here with the instructions that I'm supposed to be using here. I hope I'm getting most of that right. But I heard this from Dave, Dave's Garage YouTube channel. He used to be a developer at Microsoft. He's the guy pretty much responsible for control panel. No, I'm sorry, Task Manager. He's responsible for Task Manager. So anyway, Dave explained pretty much, how this kind of thing can happen without, this file getting super vetted, that it's up to CrowdStrike to do this. Well, they ended up, having a 0 in the wrong place in this configuration file, and it ended up, setting a pointer to read some memory that either wasn't there or was empty or something terribly wrong like that. And you guys can correct me if it matters on exactly what went wrong there. But since that driver could stop the boot process, it couldn't boot. And the only way to fix it was to actually hands on the machine, F8 or whatever it is to boot in safe mode, go in and delete that update file, that bunch of zeros 291.sys that the CrowdStrike kernel driver was looking for, and get rid of that file so it wouldn't read this errant file, and then the computer could boot using the previous file. And CrowdStrike put out an update that a correct file later on. Okay, so I've got all that, which is why this is what caused this to work. It's interesting that there's so much work that goes into making sure everything's right and signed and approved and well vetted, and yet this dynamic update process isn't vetted like that. Or it depends upon CrowdStrike saying, yep, this is good, and apparently it wasn't good. Shaun, do you or Kyle have any comment on the information that I just passed along?
Well, one, I saw a bit of Dave's video on the topic, and yeah, really, really interesting to have him break it down at a level that's not insulting to anyone's intelligence, but doesn't go completely over anyone's head either. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, as you've said, inherently, the solution requires a view of everything that's going on the network, right? And you can't get that if the software is isolated, not just from the kernel perspective. Obviously, if CrowdStrike is somewhat sandbox like every other app, it's not going to be able to see what's going on the whole system. But with that power comes the ability to crash the whole system and cause a kernel fault or kernel panic. But at the same time, it inherently kind of needs to be on all endpoints. And we say endpoints, and we probably think of user computers and things like that, which is obviously where it's valuable. But I know of a lot of situations, and I would guess that it's more common than not for people to have CrowdStrike running on servers and everything else, across their enterprise, for all the compliance reasons you said at the top of the show. And so inherently, it has to be somewhat of a single point of failure for the model to work. It can't take in data from all these different points and do machine learning and everything else on it to determine some anomaly or some pattern across the network that it needs to shut down. And I think the folks who maybe have a tendency to armchair quarterback after the fact, often are those that had a lot of time on their hands during the event, or just don't have a lot of experience or exposure, to the topic. And so it's interesting to sort of see the divide between people who had to deal with it and understand the nuances, and people that are like, haha, you should run Linux or whatever, So it's been an interesting slew of opinions.
And I that kind of quarterbacking, well, if you use Linux, you wouldn't have this problem. Well, Linux has its own set of issues that come up from time to time, certainly. Before we take our next break, Kyle, I don't want to reveal any issues that you can't reveal, but can you give our audience any kind of a clue as to, problems that affected you and your organization, and how you were able to address them and how quickly you were able to do that?
Sure. Just kind of on a high level, we have redundant playout for our national channels, like our primary channel that we run is we've got other diginets that we distribute out to Weigel-owned stations and nearly every broadcast group that's in America. So in our scenario, we had a DR system that we could resort to, and we did that just as a precaution. So that DR system, we run generally alike but different technologies just for scenarios like this. So in our case, we're able to move our national channels over to the DR and make it fairly seamless. But for local stations, here in Chicago, for example, they're operating just here out of our Chicago facility, and like several other Chicago broadcast groups, most of the stations in this town are all owned and operated by the network that they are affiliated with. We all had to go through those challenges in the overnight hours of Thursday into Friday. For us, it started with a phone call. I believe it was just before midnight. You hear, we all get these kind of calls where you hear about something, you're like, well, that's odd that server crashed, but okay, let me dial into it, take a look. Okay, it's back up, you're good. And then right before you hang up, it's like, hold on, one of our workstations just went blue screen. Like, what? And then it's like,
Huh?
all right, you're on the backup? Yeah, okay, we're on the backup. I was like, that's weird. Let me know if you see any more, stay on the backup system. We'll fix the other one in the morning. Calls back 30 seconds later, we lost 2 more machines and master control too. Like, what? And so our first instinct is, even though these are all sitting in different work groups that should not ever do Windows updates, just because my mind is, initially IT made some sort of configuration change because we're doing some stuff out of the data center and migration out there, and some configuration went drastically wrong. Well, now you're at the point where so many machines this is happening into, you just jump into the car and start flying right in as you're on the phone and bringing in other people from our team into a Teams call. And we came to the conclusion probably 45 minutes in, this definitely wasn't a Windows update and appears to be something CrowdStrike related. And it was probably an hour 15 in that we figured out. This is before CrowdStrike had pushed out any, hey, heads up, here's what's going on. But you could see the internet kind of lighting up with IT people that are starting to come to the same conclusions. And we initially found if we get the CrowdStrike just directory and relate it, change it to CrowdStrike with 2 E's, we had a machine that could boot up. So that was our initial, all right, I think we found a pathway to at least get critical machines going. And then shortly after that's when CrowdStrike came out with the fix. But we could probably talk about it later. It was that solution handled the fix the majority of the workstations, but servers were a little bit trickier when there's RAID systems involved.
Gotcha. All right. Hey, we've got an interview with David Smedley coming up. He handled a lot of this for customers of Playout One and other customers of AIR, AIIR, automation company. And so I'm going to politely ask Kyle and Shaun to stand by for a few minutes. The interview with David Smedley is coming up right after this from Broadcast Bionics.
Welcome to the Bionic Studio. The Bionic Studio brings all audience interaction to the fingertips of a production team in radio, TV, and podcast. Our workflow-led system is working 24/7 around the world for small broadcasters and national and international networks. Our telephony module, Bionic Talk Show, allows cost-effective centralization, remote operation, scalability, and resilience across an entire network of stations, but at the same time is used in single-studio self-op environments. Social media curation and activity is now considered a broadcast-critical part of programming. Bionic Social means the studio isn't overwhelmed with a wall of interaction from an ever-growing number of social platforms. We combine SMS, MMS, and email, together with a speech-to-text service for listeners using smart speakers. We enable studio teams to curate, filter, and display all platforms in one place, and post text, images, and video content to multiple platforms in one operation. Effortless collection of video content with Bionic Director has helped position some of the world's most successful stations as leaders in viral content, generating appointments to listen and free marketing via retweets and shares. Bionic Contest enables end-to-end tracking of on-air competitions, live reads, and prizes. These could be on-air contests, automated SMS entry, or online. anywhere, and Skype TX for Radio brings high-quality audio and video contribution into the studio with ease. No need for dedicated PCs to run different applications. Everything is controlled within the Bionic Studio UI, and incoming connections are visible to users along with all other platforms. Our codec integration enables connection, algorithm configuration, and directory to a wide range of IP and ISDN codecs. The Bionic Studio, a unique suite of products designed to enable your talent to work smarter.
And there's a whole lot of cool things from Broadcast Bionics to help your stations look better and sound better and operate better. So check them out at bionics.co.uk. Thanks so much, Broadcast Bionics, for sponsoring This Week in Radio Tech. Welcome back to This Week in Radio Tech. I'm Kirk Harnack here in the Telos Alliance studio. And, you know, we had this very interesting and devastating CrowdStrike issue this past Friday. It brought down a whole lot of things, but surprisingly, it brought down very few broadcasters. Now, some it really did. I'm not saying that there weren't problems. There were some really major problems, but at least here in the U.S., most U.S. radio broadcast companies were unaffected. And I'm very curious to understand why that is and talk a bit about other IT security issues. So I have with me a fellow who I've grown to love and trust. This is David Smedley. Hey, David. Good to see you.
Hi, Kirk.
It is early morning for me. And what time in the afternoon is it for you, David?
It's just around 20 past 12 now.
Oh, okay. Oh, are you missing lunch right now?
I can hold back for the lunch at the moment.
Okay. Dave, tell me about your role. You work for the folks at AIR, A-I-I-R. What's your role over there?
Yeah, so I'm the senior customer support specialist. So I champion, the support with the team. We make sure that, the installations and everything that we do for clients, we support our clients and make sure that, everything runs smoothly.
Well, in the interest of full disclosure, Kirk Harnack and some of my radio stations that I'm a small part owner of are avid, wildly enthusiastic customers of AIR, the Playout One system. We've been using that for years. Started out in our Hawaii station and liked it so much that now all across all of our stations in Mississippi, Arkansas, Hawaii, and American Samoa, we're customers. And so I thought of, well, okay, let's ask somebody at Playout One at AIR about this CrowdStrike thing, and then let's also talk about some best IT practices. Even if you weren't affected by the CrowdStrike problem, let's find out what David Smedley has to say about that. David, let's look back to last Friday with when people started waking up in Australia and then across Asia, Europe, and finally the United States, waking up to a lot of blue screens of death, and this happens so much in the transportation industry, big corporations, airlines. Millions of people ended up, maybe millions, hundreds of thousands anyway. People ended up getting stuck in airports and having a really bad day, and it did affect some broadcasters. Let's see if we can understand what the CrowdStrike problem was. Can you help us put an angle on what actually happened there?
Yeah. So initially, from obviously what we saw in the news reports, it was kind of a misunderstanding of what was going off, because the news reports were saying that, oh, it's Microsoft, it's a Windows update and things like that. And, we're sort of almost thinking that we were going to head back to, the Y2K and Millennium Bug scenario that never actually did happen. Now, what CrowdStrike is it's an advanced threat protection software. So it's more high level than your standard antivirus software. So instead of sitting, sort of in the level where it's running on the machine, where when the user actually powers it up, this sits at the point when the operating system tries to boot at the kernel level. So what happened effectively there is a patch was pushed out from CrowdStrike. From how I understand, it may have missed testing, and because it missed testing, there was a little bit of code, a line of code in there, which was then causing a memory exception, which then Windows at that point blue screens.
Yep. And in fact, I was doing a little bit of listening and research on this. Apparently, in the file they pushed out, there was a memory pointer that pointed to a location in memory that either had nothing or it was an invalid memory location. And this is something that Windows, at least with a kernel level driver, just doesn't Yeah, no, I can't do that. Absolutely. And there's no exception. Had this been like an application running at application level, it may have been recoverable, but this was a kernel level driver. Can you, you know something about programming. What does that mean that it's a kernel level driver?
So it means it hits the operating system at the point when it does the initial startup process. So it's not something that would be, depending on, like you say, a low level resource. What it means is it actually sits deep within the operating system core itself. So it's very tightly integrated with Windows, and it's part of the main core processors when you actually boot that machine up.
Gotcha. Now, I may be incorrect. Maybe you can correct me, or maybe about what I do. CrowdStrike is a service that many companies, especially publicly traded companies in the U.S., which are required under certain laws to take care of their IT security, and it's been a very convenient way to outsource some of the best expertise into keeping your systems safe, at least safer than they would be without it. So instead of having 300 people in your IT team for a large corporation, maybe you can have 30 people on your IT team and outsource a lot of that low-level difficult work, which means that if the people that you're outsourcing to mess that up, you could be in some really big trouble. Do you have any? Am I kind of right about my thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, we've evolved in the world where initially you would have had, your antivirus software on your machines, but because of all the threats and all the, the various ways now that people or the hackers are trying to get into machines, it means that we have to sort of up our game a little bit in terms of security. And that's where solutions like CrowdStrike come into play, because effectively what they do is they're not just your regular antivirus, it's advanced threat protection. So it's doing more than just scanning for malicious files. It's looking at patterns and behaviors, and it can, detect if a user's logging on at 2 o'clock in the morning, but they shouldn't be doing that. And there's a lot of intelligence that's sort of baked into solutions like that.
Interesting. Of course, that can be true anytime that you outsource something, right? I know maybe most of us as homeowners, we've outsourced the repair of a plumbing problem to a company that maybe didn't do a very good job of repairing our plumbing problem, and now we have a bigger problem. Certainly, most of us have done car repairs or have had car repairs done that maybe weren't done all that well. My mom lived in a condo for years, and the original construction of the condo wasn't correct in terms of the flashing around the windows. And so there was water ingress and mold, and it was a big problem for the entire complex. So it's whenever we outsource something, we always take a chance that maybe it would be done. Now, of course, if I did plumbing repairs myself, that's probably even worse. So there's not always a great solution here for outsourcing problems. So, okay, so we have a little bit of understanding of CrowdStrike. Did you yourself hear about broadcasters getting affected by this? I think I heard a story over lunch yesterday about a TV station, a local TV station, that was horribly affected. Basically, their local news was two talking heads for 2 hours because they couldn't play back anything, not even a lower third crawl. What have you heard about this?
So the first thing that we saw here in the UK was obviously the reports starting to come through on the news channels. And like I said before, it was speculated this was a Microsoft issue. Nobody had really heard of CrowdStrike, sort of in the wider IT world, really. But what happened was again, we had a television channel as well, a national news channel. And yeah, they couldn't run anything. They was effectively, off the air for a couple of hours, and then they came back on, and all they could do is read the reports from the phone, because they couldn't do the ticker tape at the bottom. They couldn't show any they couldn't show any clips or anything like that, because the systems were very limited, because the rest of the machines in that broadcast center had blue screens. Wow.
So in the US, very few broadcasters were affected. Radio broadcasters were affected, and I think that there are plenty of U.S. broadcasters who have separate on-air systems from their business systems, and maybe a little part of that is due to having maybe two networks. I know because I'm in the world of Livewire, Axia, audio over IP. A lot of the broadcasters I deal with have a separate network for their audio over IP, and many people still try to prevent their automation systems from being on the public internet. 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, we probably had less knowledge and less good tools to make sure those things were as safe as possible. And some of those practices still continue. A lot of people say, no, I'm not putting my automations on the public internet. Well, good luck updating several things that way. Talk to me about, let's move into best practices for IT, since this is a great time to open that door and have that conversation. You work with a lot of people who have Playout One. I'm a customer of that. I think I'm doing things fairly right, but maybe I'm not sure. So you get phone calls from people who I'm sure have experienced a problem in one way or another. What are maybe a few of your top suggestions, or how do people get badly affected by malware or bad people? And what are some of the top things that people should be thinking about doing to prevent that?
So in terms of, like you say, with the roles of machines, it's always a good practice to keep what you do in terms of broadcast critical stuff, and for what you do with office level things, checking emails, reading text messages, SMS and things like that. Keep those two machines separate. So if you're in a studio, don't have your on-air machine, the one that's going to be, opening up YouTube and things like that, because it's when you go onto the internet and when you go into things like that, that's where you can potentially expose a machine to vulnerabilities. Now, if that machine is effectively sitting there just playing back audio, it's playing, your sweepers, your jingles, your liners and songs and things like that, then there's a considerably less chance that you're going to get something like malware onto a machine. Now, typically as broadcasters, we have this love-hate relationship with antivirus software, where our brain tells us that we really want it, but it's also that things like real-time scanning can affect a machine's performance. And the last thing you want is a machine that is fundamentally every part of that machine is there to play back audio, that having a system like, a third-party antivirus software you tend to steer clear of it. So having the security on the office level machines is absolutely advisable. But in terms of, obviously, for your playback and your automation machines, then what we found is that as sort of Windows has evolved, and now we're at Windows 11, that Windows' own built-in Windows Defender is actually really good nowadays. Microsoft has spent millions invested into it, and it's such a well integrated bit of software, because it's actually built with the operating system, that you're not then introducing anything that potentially could bottleneck a machine. Now, in terms of other things to do, it's again the same thing with Windows updates, that typically you don't want your machine rebooting at randomly while your jock's on the air. So what you would do is you would block Windows updates, but then what tends to happen is you would block Windows updates and forget about it, and at that point you're running 3, 4, 5 revisions of an actual major build of Windows behind. So I think it's always good practice to, have scheduled maintenance once a month. Go in there, go and update the machines, make sure they are running the latest patches and drivers and things like that, and do it in a controlled manner. So don't go and do every machine in one go. Sort of set a bit of time aside to take a few machines, do the updates on those and move forward on there. And at least you can then stop if you encounter an issue, rather than rolling everything out and, it just turns into chaos.
Good advice there. I'm going to have a few specific questions, but on the Windows updates, I like to figure out what radio station could we do without if it died, and update that one.
It's always take the sample of the one that you think, well, I could risk this one, so let's try this one out. Okay, that's all fine. I'll move on and do the ones that the ones that really do matter, because they're the ones generating the commercial revenue.
Yeah, exactly. So let me ask a few specific things that just come to my mind. With an automation system that maybe you reboot your computer, it logs in automatically. The automation system hopefully is set up to start playing automatically. Does that automation system typically need to be logged in as a user or as an administrator?
Typically, it would be an administrator account, and as much as it would be great to say, have this limited access account, because the playout system is, it's using file shares, it's using access to SQL. There's so much going off. It's so real time that actually you can't tend to use a standard user account, because you would then have to tweak the permissions, and there's lots of little bits that you would have to do, and you just put roadblocks in the way, especially in terms of supporting as well. If you need to uninstall and reinstall, then a standard user account isn't going to have access to be able to uninstall applications.
So and I think when you guys do an installation, you kind of make it hidden where users of your automation system don't have quick taskbar access to the browser. You don't want people checking their email on the same machine that's playing back on the air, right?
Yeah, so we tend to, as part of the process, when we onboard a client with Playout One Pro, we will make sure that Windows is tidied up. You're not having things like the weather and the widgets and all these other things that Microsoft have baked in, which is great for the home user and the end user. But on the automation system, like, the only thing that should be on the screen is the automation software. So yeah, we try to tidy this up and sort of put it in a way that it's a bit of a deterrent, really, from a user using that to go check the Facebook messages and things that might let something malicious into the machine.
So one of the things that, at least for me, seems like a best practice, where we do have control rooms, where we have people sitting in there for hours at a time, running radio stations, the machine that's playing back the automation, that's all it does. And they really can't easily use that machine for anything else. But I give them another machine, maybe even two machines, for internet browsing, for checking their email. And on those machines, they're running as a user, not as an administrator. If I did install some antivirus other than Defender, which I agree with you, I like Microsoft Defender. It does seem to do quite well. Anyway, that's where I want the machine protected, and automatic updates are fine at 2 a.m. on a machine that somebody's touching all the time. Do you have any comments on that idea? Give them a machine to play with that is relatively safeguarded.
Yeah, that's absolutely the way that I'd recommend people doing it is those Office machines. They're the ones that are getting the general use. They're the ones that are probably the most at risk from bringing something malicious into the network. Now, that's not to say that an impact on that machine wouldn't be would be as severe as it would be if it hit a server, but it's the gateway in one of those machines becomes. So, it's good to keep them isolated. It's good to have, up to your game, really, in terms of security on those Office level machines, in a way that, the impact of having a security software isn't going to be as heavy as an impact as it would be to try and put that onto an automation system where there's a lot of real-time actions and a lot of, moving parts, really, with it that a typical third-party antivirus software might affect.
We're talking with David Smedley with AIR, and he's head of support and customer experiences and all that kind of stuff. And again, as a disclaimer, I'm a customer of theirs, and I've been absolutely delighted with their service. They're quick to act, and just love them. David, as a last topic that we have time for, because we're running out of time, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about firewalls, routing, port forwarding, that kind of thing. What do people need to make sure is in place at their broadcast facility, and what really might bite them in the butt if they're not careful about what they're doing?
Yeah, so the thing to really check is to make sure that a really big one is your router, your router that you've had from your internet service provider, or maybe you've bought one from a third party. Make sure that the password isn't the default one. If it's admin, you've opened yourself up to a world of vulnerabilities there. Now, what tends to happen is some places and some occasions I've heard of people changing the passwords, but then they've gone and lost the password. So having, a password management system, 1Password is quite a good one. Having something like that to have it all recorded is a good idea, because you can then lock it into a vault. Now, with services like WebVT that we have for Playout One, you open a port. Now, for that, you need to make sure that you are only opening that port that is required. Don't open, all the ports. Don't have it on a DMZ or anything like that. Like, ensure that, if you're going to, change the IP address of that machine, make sure that you take the rule out, and make sure that you're aware of what you've set on that router. You know what's going off. And you're not going into a firewall scenario where you're just going, well, let's turn everything off. It's better to allow things through rather than just going for a global rule of just having everything switched off.
Sometimes people put in an audio codec or something that's expecting an outward message to come into it. And it's been explained to me by the developers of codecs, and maybe this applies to things like WebVT in your system, that if somebody does try to send either a malicious or they're just poking around packet and they happen upon the port that your codec is sitting on or that your WebVT is sitting on, at least in the codec world, if the packet that comes in is not recognizable as something that device is expecting to see, if it's just it's just a hacker out there to, here's an open port, that at least the codec, and I'm looking at one behind me here, this zip one from Telus. If it's not a codec, if it's not a packet that has the information that the codec's looking for, the codec just drops it. It doesn't. In other words, I'm not saying it's never possible to get in because I don't know that, but the codec itself, if the packet isn't for that codec and it doesn't recognize exactly what's in that packet, then the easiest thing in the world is the codec just to say, no, sorry, drop it, and it doesn't go any farther. Do WebVT or other services where you're looking for an outside person to come in to log in, do they work in any way similarly?
Yeah, so we have restrictions in place in terms of WebVT that the only things you can upload into there is audio files. So, if you suddenly get a PDF file that's trying to go in there, that won't make it into the service. Now, what is good that we do is that we run yearly pen testing on WebVT itself. So, we can find if there's any vulnerabilities and things like that. And we take security on services like that very, very seriously. And we do the same for our websites as well, and mobile apps and everything like that runs on the content management system that we have. So yeah, security is key really from those sort of things, and make sure that we can get any vulnerabilities patched before they could become a big issue.
David Smedley, I've enjoyed this time together. Is in any last word, anything I haven't asked you about that you want to make sure to mention about just good IT practices, good security practices?
I'd probably say having a disaster recovery plan. In the case of we've seen both in the US and the UK that if these machines are blue screening and you lose your radio station or lose your television channel, then you need to have a way of being able to continue whilst that's being dealt with. Because of what happened with CrowdStrike, it was a manual user thing to have to, an IT engineer had to go in and they had to manually edit a file to allow that machine to then come back online. It wasn't like something could be pushed out automatically. So you need a disaster recovery plan, because you could be down for, if someone's got to travel, across 4 or 5 states potentially, or even further, that this could impact you for a number of hours. So having a disaster recovery plan, having a backup is definitely something that you need to think about. Whether that's a backup machine at the transmitter, whether that is a secondary playout machine somewhere that you do separate level of patching on, that you patch one week and you patch the next one the other week, and then you've got redundancy there in place.
One thing that's been a real help to us is we have at my group of stations, we have enough formats that are similar in different or nearby markets where for several of our stations, a web stream, and it could be a private high quality web stream, is the backup. So we can go to remotely into a transmitter site and tell it, hey, don't play what's coming out of the audio processor. Play this stream instead. And okay, it'll be the wrong call sign for a little while we get the automation system fixed or whatever our problem was. So that's great advice. Have a backup disaster recovery plan. And part of what you guys do with Playout One, all of our systems get backed up to Google Drive, don't they?
Absolutely, yeah. So we've got cloud backup, which it's a fantastic addition that we added in version 4.10, where it means that you can use these services, Google Drive, OneDrive, and Dropbox, and you upload a piece of audio that backs up to the cloud. And if you make a change to that piece of audio, well, that becomes a revision because they've got all these technologies built in, like revision history. Now, what is nice about this is that we have a checker inside of Monitor. So if more than 5% of the entire audio library changes in under 60 seconds, that's, it's bad behavior. You're looking there that there's something malicious going off, more than likely. So what that will do is that will then seize the backups from running so that that data that's in the cloud is safe and it's good and it's not affected, and you can then restore that onto another system if you want to. Obviously doing other actions, like if you've bulk edit and things, you can trigger these things, but it's better to be safe than sorry with these sort of things. But yeah, definitely having offsite backups is as important as having an on-site backup.
David, we're out of time, but if you could direct us to a website where maybe people chat about, or you have advice or best practices posted. I guess your company's website has some of those resources available. Yeah.
Yeah, if you go to air.com, head to the support section. We've got loads of articles on there. We're always adding more content onto there, so it's definitely a good place to to look, and feel free to reach out to us, support@air.com. For any further questions.
And that's AIR, AIIR, spelled funny because it's the internet. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes for the show. David Smedley, thank you so much for spending this time with us. I sure appreciate it.
Thanks, Kurt. Great to chat.
All right. And we'll be right back with more This Week in Radio Tech in just a couple minutes. This Week in Radio Tech is brought to you in part by Broadcasters General Store, and they represent Henry Engineering. Now, Henry Engineering. Most of us got familiar with Henry Engineering for the Super Relay, right? To start your cassette deck, to start telescoping, recording your show, right? Or to light the on-air light. Well, one of the cool things that Henry Engineering has come out with for a few years now is the back UPS. We love UPSs. And sometimes we hate UPSs because they don't always work when they're supposed to. And I've had plenty of experience with that. Has it been my fault? I don't know. I don't think so. Expanded batteries, things like that. And we found a UPS model that if the batteries are depleted, when the power comes back on, it doesn't restart. It can't restart. Not buying that one again. What back UPS is a 15 amp relay. And you think, well, that's not that special, but it actually is, because it's very conveniently allows you to power a rack or several computers or whatever you may have from either the UPS normally, or immediately switch over to shore power if the UPS fails. And so at one of my radio stations, we have some computers that don't have dual power supplies, and a few other items in the rack that don't have dual power supplies. For example, we have an Omnia 11. Omnia 11 does not have dual power supplies. It's got a really good power supply, but it's not dual. And same thing for our Sage EAS box and a few other things. We have an Ethernet switch that does not have dual power supplies. But you know what? We have a power strip that is powered by this back UPS. And this back UPS is powered by primarily the UPS, but secondarily by shore power. So if the UPS dies, which it has, we're still on the air as long as there's shore power, and we hope there is. And this also allows you to do maintenance on your UPS without worry of cutting things off and having to plug and replug and take computers up and down and things like that. Love this box from Hank at Henry Engineering, Hank Landsberg, and this box just works really, really well. Now, this is not a great, big, huge solution. It's not meant to handle racks and racks worth of current. No, it's rated at 15 amps, so it'll handle a few items in your rack. It just works out perfectly for a few workstations for us in our rack and the other items that I mentioned. Now, things that I have that already have two power supplies in them, like some servers, well, we we plug those into two different power strips, right? One UPS and one not. And that works fine too. But the back UPS has been a real lifesaver. Check it out. You can go to henryeng.com. And if you want to buy one, the place to go, Broadcasters General Store, bgs.cc. Love these people. Their website, of course, is open 24/7. Their phone lines, I've never called them and not gotten an answer. Now, I haven't tried at 2 a.m., but they're good. They answer the phone. They got sharp pencils. They can tell you where your products are. Love the folks at Broadcasters General Store. Have been my friends for years and years. Check them out at bgs.cc. Thanks to BGS for sponsoring This Week in Radio Tech. All right, let's jump right back in with our live guests. We've got Kyle Walker and Shaun Dolan here. Kyle and Shaun, I wonder if we might turn our attention to some best practices, a little bit like David Smedley and I were talking about toward the end of that interview. I know you're both eager to spout some good advice, but I'm looking for some best practice advice right now for broadcasters. What are the top 2 or 3 things on your mind right now? Shaun, you want to jump in first on that idea?
Sure, I'd love to. Yeah. This one's more of a esoteric one, but I think it's important. Whenever we have a sort of big dramatic event like this, and people sort of cluster, have a tendency to overreact in one direction or another. And broadcast engineers generally we have a heritage of wanting complete control and redundancy of systems, and sometimes we've seen these tendencies hold us back. Like, for example, we've all probably encountered folks that have a complete aversion to anything that uses the internet, who just aren't familiar with stuff like SD-WAN. And those are often the same folks that are now saying, hey, see, I told you this is what would happen. But I think that completely misses the point. That's like rolling past a car accident in your horse and buggy and wagging your finger at the driver and saying, see, I knew that no good would come of this combustion engine thing. My main concern is just, making sure we continue to take like a measured approach. On the one hand, this is a 100-year storm, basically. So it might be tempting to just say this is a one-off thing and not bother doing any serious post-mortem, or saying it's too big of a problem to solve and not doing a serious post-mortem. But on the other hand, this is a huge learning opportunity. And let's be honest, for many people, a very expensive one. So why would we not, get the most value out of it? Not overreact and overcorrect in either direction.
Good. That is really and true. And in fact, for people who are at the moment saying, well, I wouldn't use CrowdStrike. Well, guess what? CrowdStrike going forward now, for at least for a while, is going to be the safest thing out there, because they're going to make sure that their testing procedures are better. In fact, I just read an article during David Smedley's interview that indicated, we have a test procedure and it failed. It did not catch this particular bug, and you can bet they're going to fix that. Kyle, what about a couple of ideas from you for best practice? What should people be looking for to secure their systems?
Sure. I think Shaun brought up some great points, and David as well. One thing that I would suggest, and this applies to so many things outside of IT, is I always tell my folks here, you don't know what you don't know. Always seek expert advice, cross-examine multiple opinions. You're going to get 3 different people, and engineers especially. They all have the right answer, and there's 3 totally different answers. But generally, a lot of them will kind of follow the same theme. So kind of cross-referencing, even in some of these scenarios with CrowdStrike, talking to other stations that may have had these issues. What did you do? What would you do differently? And just taking all those different elements. Other areas as well is modern OS and software. I often spend a lot of time in Florida, and there's a station down there that I saw them looking for help, and I'm like, what the heck? Near where I'm going to be, I'll see what's going on there just for fun. They were telling me the software they were using, Cool Edit Pro, and I'm like, holy cow! Like, I mean, I was like, I haven't used that in years. Is that even still around? Oh yeah, it's not. It hasn't been, Cool Edit Pro since 2003. But a lot of stations will say, well, that's all they'll buy. I'm not even going to bring up the new software because I know they're never going to buy it. But we're in a totally different world right now. It's completely different than what it was 10 years ago. Using Windows 98 just because that's what you need to run the software that hasn't been made in 20 years. I mean, that is such a big risk. And those kind of systems, at the end of the day, really stations that are still using that kind of infrastructure need to come up with some quick plans to get out. Um, David mentioned tech infrastructure on its own network. I mean, you could have a whole show about different good practices, best practices to do there. But just on a very high level, at a minimum, if you're at a basic radio or TV station, the tech infrastructure on its own network, I would start out by blacklisting everything outside of that network, and you only whitelist what IPs and ports need to get in. There's sometimes we'll talk to different broadcasters, and I'll say, okay, well, I'm going to connect my link up to you. Let me let you know what my IP is. And they're like, oh, no, you don't need to do that. Just here's my IP. Come on in. I hear that. I'm like, oh, no. That means anybody can come in. I mean, anything hitting your technical infrastructure needs to have is blacklisted. I only am going to whitelist the port, or I'm sorry, the IP of the person who's coming into me that I expect. And not only that, the port, but even a step further, the last element is, and we've been getting into this heavy in the last 5 years or so, layer 4 through 7 routing. And on a very high level, it takes it another step past here's the IP to allow, here's the port to allow. Layer 4 through 7 routing will say, because it's somebody that says, Kirk, what you brought up, here's the IP, here's the port. Okay, maybe it hit a codec, and the codec says, I don't understand it. I'm disregarding. But imagine that was a computer and someone from another country has found a way to get right into the machine. With level 4 through 7 routing, you can take it a step further to say, further, this traffic coming in is only going to be XML data. That is, or a text file. That's all you should ever have coming into it. Anything else, reject. So it's actually going to scrub those packets and say, I'm actually going to see if it's the type of traffic that I'm expecting to see.
Good point. Good point. Hey, we've got, just to let you know, we've got a hard out time at quarter after, so we'll have to end the show within the next 12 minutes or so. I'm curious about, we've been looking at, people gaining access through ports or through a DMZ. Somebody, hey, the only way I could get my Sage EAS to get me remote access was to put it in the DMZ of my router, and I put the whole freaking network in the DMZ of my, stupid things like that. And I have found other people's, EAS boxes just through Shodan, right? Just easy stuff like that. But my question really, and either one of you can take this or both, is what is the difference in our threat, our openness to a threat from a technical threat like IP addresses or things coming in through an open port and that kind of thing versus a what's the right word, where somebody clicks on something that they shouldn't, and then they open up some an executable that runs some ransomware, and now you're kind of hosed because this ransomware is now loose in your computer, and it's looking for all the things that might be connected over the network, places to go grab. Maybe contrast these two different threats, or which one is a worse threat to us at this point in broadcasting. Shaun, would you like to take that for just a minute?
Sure. Well, obviously very topical because, that's one of the key things that solutions, endpoint protection solutions like CrowdStrike work really well for. Seeing, like Kyle said, you running a simple antivirus scan, even if it knows about the threat, doesn't necessarily mean anything on a single machine. But when you combine behavior together and realize there's a pattern across the network of certain resources being accessed that aren't normally accessed, then that's something where a tool like CrowdStrike really shines and has obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but has saved a lot more heartache, I think, over the years than looking at it as a holistic solution than just this, one incident. It's one of those things where you don't think about it, obviously, until it, breaks. And you don't really get credit for all the times that it actually protected you. So, on the one hand, I'm wondering if on a more forward basis, there'll be a more targeted use of endpoint protection tools. I think that could be one way people evolve from this situation, where instead of installing endpoint protection on every single device, including core infrastructure, including things that a human may never log into. Maybe that not only a server that only has SSH access or something that's looked at occasionally, but now, especially with larger data center rollouts and cloud deployments, the only thing that's logging into these devices are essentially orchestration tools, right? And so maybe there'll be a tendency towards only applying endpoint protection where there's a lot of anomalies or a lot of unpredictable user behavior, and then using other ways of security, like securing the orchestration tools on critical infrastructure. And that way, you've sort of segmented the two systems.
We've got just enough time for a tip of the week coming up right after our final commercial message. And I really appreciate our advertisers. I hope you do too. They make it possible for me to invest the money that I need to produce the show, to pay Suncast a little bit of money under the table, and so forth. So we're gonna hit a couple of advertisers right now. We'll be back with Kyle and with Shaun with a tip of the week. They're saving their best for last. Right, gentlemen? Right. Our show is brought to you in part by Angry Audio and the new Rave console. We've been talking about the Rave for about a year now, but guess what? Finally, it's shipping, and everybody is happy about that. Customers who have received it are delighted with it. The new Rave console from Angry Audio, it's got some cool features about it, like 2 stereo output mix buses, program and audition, preview or cue on every input, of course. Channels 1 through 4 are switchable between mic and line, and the mic preamps are built in for you. The on-off buttons are slightly recessed to prevent accidental actuation. Part of the benefits here is designed by Mike Dosh, who's been designing consoles, including PR&E consoles, for many years now. Channels 5 and 6 are switchable between pro levels and, those RCA connectors. They call those IHF levels. It has an ergonomic wrist rest. Channels 7 and 8 are capable of mix minus. There are 2 mix minus outputs with talkback. How about that? The faders, well, they are full throw faders for monitor and headphone volume. And the monitor selector gives you talkback to guess. It has a built-in high power headphone amplifier. You might need to talk to your audiologist after you use this. And it has flexible monitoring for the board operator to listen to whatever you need to listen to. Plus an on-air indicator. Lights up when the mics are open and the monitors are muted. Lots of features, easy to wire up because it uses the Studio Hub standard for all the connectors except the mics. You can plug in XLRs to the mics. Check this thing out, the Rave console now shipping from Angry Audio. The website is angryaudio.com. Thanks a lot, Angry Audio, for sponsoring This Week in Radio Tech. Our show is also brought to you by Max Connect and Max Connect Wireless. It's always a good idea to remind you about what's available in their 4G LTE modem with prioritized data. It has saved my butt several times, and radio stations that I've, helped out with it. Here is someone to tell you more about it.
Large corporations, we were looking for a product that would give us the ultimate security at our transmitter sites and as well as with our broadcast equipment. Max Connect fits the bill very well. Its greatest security feature is the fact that it gives you a single static IP address. Using this single static IP address allows us to close hundreds of open ports on our firewalls across the company and restrict access to only the Max Connect IPs. This has greatly reduced our exposure to the World Wide Web and made us much more secure moving forward. It has also given us the ability to expand as needed in a secure fashion.
That's interesting. John Takak right there talking about the same thing that Shaun was talking about just a minute ago about, only allowing the things that you are sure of through your firewall, and Max Connect having a static IP address for you. You have a remote transmitter site. Maybe you've got a Burke remote control that needs to talk two ways with the, back to your home office. It makes it perfect. Works great. Max Connect, you can choose your carrier, your cellular carrier. You can even get a Max Connect that has 2 SIM cards in it, and that way, if one carrier has a problem, it'll automatically switch over to the other. I've got one of those. It is just as cool as can be. So check it out. Thanks, Max Connect, for sponsoring This Week in Radio Tech. All right, a couple minutes remaining. We're going to get a tip of the week from each of our guests. Why don't we surprise Kyle Walker first? Kyle, you're in the spotlight right now. What should people walk away with some good information from you?
Oh boy. Tip
We
of
can
the
come
week.
back to you now.
Is this just kind of general or with regards to cybersecurity?
Hey, whatever you like, man. I mean, how do you want our viewers and listeners to remember Kyle Walker?
Oh boy, this is pretty bad. This is one that's going to take like 5 minutes, and everybody's like, "I'm already doing this." We've been playing around a lot recently with SNMP. I mean, for a long time we've been doing SNMP, but SNMP, but really good customized dashboard notification systems. So there's a lot of different SNMP systems that are out there. We're using one Nagios. But we've been able to really capture a lot of these different transmitter sites that we have throughout the country and give us a nice, clear perspective of what that looks like, any notification, any thresholds when they've hit different limits. I mean, before we would have, systems or things like that, they're kind of scattered to where to get a holistic picture, you needed to look at this system, this system, this system, and this system, and together you could get a picture. Now with SNMP, number one, almost all equipment supports SNMP now. So you can kind of create your own dashboard to see everything going on at a site here in our own facility in Chicago, air conditionings and server rooms, down to, generator systems, just everything about everything in one holistic dashboard view so that you have a single pane of glass to be able to see everything that's going on in all different locations. It does take some time to put in, some time to test notifications, but it pays itself off in dividends when you have
See, you are not the first person that has said that. And let me ask you, do you have any recommended, like, how did you learn to deal with SNMP? Like, did you have a breakthrough moment, or did you watch some videos, or you just have to get your hands really dirty playing with it and stub your toe a few times to figure out, oh, that's how that works?
Well, full disclosure, if you threw me in front of a computer and said, now make it happen for me, I would be making a couple of quick phone calls because I knew exactly what I wanted and the dashboard to do it. But we're fortunate to have some very good staff, including developers on our staff here. So quite a few of them are pretty good with going into MIBs and configuring those, talking to a vendor for things that aren't quite published to get some feedback coming off that. But it is one. I mean, my son does a lot with SNMP, so you can watch some YouTube videos and you can figure it out. And it takes quite a bit of time, which is not something that all of us have these days. But it just takes small bites off the apple and one general area, and before you know it, especially if you have, on TV, we have a lot of roadie transmitters or radio not tell. Once you really get it figured out around one transmitter, it's a lot easier to then start cloning all these other sites and looking at, again, just a nice, clean dashboard. Then you can advance and start getting custom notifications on your phone, and you really get yourself to a point where you're finding out about symptoms of problems before even a board operator even realizes it's a problem. Which is, a state all of us as engineers want to get to.
That's excellent advice. Hey, if I want to know anything about Minecraft, I ask my son. That's my source of info. Shaun, do you have a quick tip of the week for us?
Yeah, and it actually plays off of the observability metrics topic that Kyle was talking about, and that's having a incident response and management system that is worth its weight in gold, especially when you have an incident like the one we're talking about over this past week. When you have a centralized place where all your alerts are coming to, when they're organized by service, when in our case, the service we use has some machine learning built in to actually group alerts and be able to figure out based on parsing them out, simple things like when an audio feed goes silent and automatically clearing the alarm when the audio feed comes back, and not constantly pinging you when there's a new problem. When there's a lot of problems, that is huge to be able to log in and see everything in a single interface, as opposed to just keep getting calls from the Burke.
These sound like topics that I would love to explore more, perhaps with each of you coming up. But we got to go right now. Thanks so much, Kyle Walker and Shaun Dolan, for being our guests on This Week in Radio Tech. Love having you guys on. It's been very educational. Big thanks to Suncast, our producer, for being right on the ball and helping us out here. Thanks very much, Suncast. And to the GFQ Network, thanks also very much. Hey, like and subscribe, please, and see our advertisers. We'll see you next week on This Week in Radio Tech.